There's 3 kinds of solder that's most commonly used: hard, medium, and easy. The difference between these 3 kinds of solder is their melting temperature and flow temperature. The hard solder has the highest melting temperature. The easy solder has the lowest melting temperature. In practice, if you were going to solder 3 small pieces onto the same large piece of metal, then you will start with the hard solder, and then you will do the medium solder, and then last you will do the easy solder. This is to prevent your first solder from melting when you are doing the second and third solder. But you always want to keep in mind that even if you are using hard, medium, and easy solder in the right order, there is still a chance of unsoldering the hard solder when you are soldering with medium. If this ever happens, you can try soldering with a smaller torch tip so that you have more control over the heat. You can also use some things like whiteout to cover your first solder when you're doing the second solder to prevent the first solder from melting again. It is extremely important that you label your solders, and when you solder, you always want to use as much hard solder as possible to provide a really strong connection. And a lot of the things that I'm covering in this video will be in your handout, so make sure you read them if you haven't already. In this video, I'll be showing you how to make a sheet-to-sheet connection and wire-to-sheet connection, as well as how to make jump rings. And this is what is due next week for your samples. You need to hand in 1 sheet-to-sheet connection, 1 wire-to-sheet connection, and 1 wire-to-wire connection. And they all need to be sanded to 600 grits. Before you start soldering, you want to make sure that you prepare your solder, metal, and flux according to the handout. Solder will not fill gaps, so you want to make sure that you have really good fitting. Sometimes when you first start soldering, you think that solder can sort of fill gaps, but it will provide a really fragile connection. After all the preparation, we are going to start by hammering your solder wire into flat sheets. This is to prevent your solder from flying when you're cutting it. You want to only cut the amount that you will be needing. This is to prevent your solder from oxidizing and getting dirty. But if you have any left, you can get a little container to store the leftover solder bits. Again, you want to label them correctly with hard, medium, and easy so you don't get them mixed. And these are the tools that you will be needing. This is a solder pick and a tweezer. These are for picking up the solder when you are soldering. And this brush is for brushing the flux onto the metal. Flux is used to help prevent oxidizing when you're soldering, and it allows solder to flow. And you want to make sure that your flux is at a creamy consistency, not watery. This is called a third hand. It helps you hold your metal in place when you solder. These are T-pins, so this is also something you can use to hold your metal in place when you are soldering. The third hand you can sign out from the tool room. The T-pins, you will have to get your own from the bookstore. And this is called binding wire. You are going to use it more often when you are soldering more complex forms. So we won't be needing that for today's video, but you will be needing them in the future. And before you turn on the torch, you want to check for the right torch tip. This is probably too big since I am going to be soldering something small. And after changing the torch tip, you will also be adjusting the pressure. Choosing the right tip is extremely important because you don't want to solder something really small with a big tip. It is really hard to control the heat and direct the heat to where you want it to go. If you are soldering something really big with a small tip, then you probably won't get your piece hot enough. That means your solder will not melt or flow. And remember, you always want to have your needle wells on the right side. And please don't touch the threaded part with your hands. And also remember to wear gloves when you're changing the torch tip to prevent yourself from burning. I will start with soldering wire to sheet, and since I cut this wire with a plier, the edge is not perfectly flat, so I will have to flat it out to provide a perfect fitting. So I'm doing that right now with my file. I'm going in there and just flattening out the edge so that the edge is perfectly flat and aligned with the sheet that I'm soldering on. And if you zoom in, you can see that now the edge is perfectly flat and it should be good to go. This technique that I'm using here is called sweat soldering. So that is pre-flowing solder on one piece and then soldering them together. And flux is being applied to the end of the wire. And this section is where I want my solder to pre-flow. When you heat up the metal, your flux will turn from wet to dry, and then it will start to bubble up, and then it will turn transparent. Turning transparent is a sign indicating that the solder is ready to flow, and that is what I'm doing right now. I directed my wire to the solder and keep heating it up until the solder pre-flows onto the wire. And since the wire is not too bad, there's not too much oxidation, therefore I'm not going to be pickling and cleaning. I'm just going to go ahead and start heating the sheet. And now you can see that the flux is turning clear, so that is an indication of the metal being hot enough to solder. And when you see the solder flow, you're going to pull away the torch quickly. This technique is really handy when you are soldering something really small to something big, because in order for solder to flow onto both pieces, you have to get them into the same temperature. And when the metal cools down a little bit, it's no longer red. It is time for you to quench it in water. And after quenching it, you're going to leave your piece in the pickle. If you are pickling a flat sheet of metal, then you want to make sure that you lie it against the side in the pickle pot, not flat. If you leave it flat in the pickle pot, the back of the piece will not get pickled and it will not get cleaned. And if you lie it against the side like this, then the back will get cleaned as well. After 5 to 10 minutes, you're going to take out your metal and clean your metal under running water with soap and brass brush. Next, I will do a sheet-to-sheet connection, and I am just using a third hand to help hold it in place and apply some flux onto the place where I want my solder to flow. A third hand also acts as a heat shrink when you are soldering, so you can always use the third hand to help you pull some of the heat away when you are soldering something small to something big. As you can imagine, when heating up something really small, it takes less time than heating up something really big. So that is why you can kind of make your piece bigger by adding a heat shrink onto your small pieces. So that's also another way to use a third hand. Right now, I'm just adding the solder bit to the seam where I want my solder to flow. You can also do this after your flux becomes clear, but I wanted to show you what it's like when you do it before. Right now, I am going to heat up the entire piece. I'm not just heating up the solder seam, I am heating up the entire piece. As you can see, the flux is beginning to bubble and the solder bits is being pushed away from the solder seam. So all I have to do is using a solder pick or a tweezer, push the solder bits back to the solder seam after the flux stops bubbling. As you heat up the entire piece, you can start to see the flux is becoming more transparent. And when it becomes clear, it is an indication of your solder ready to flow. So now it is time for you to go in and direct the hottest point of the torch into the solder seam. So that is the blue flame on the inside. The reason for that is because solder will only want to flow to where it's hottest the most, and you are just using your torch as a guide of where you want your solder to flow. After your piece cools down, it is time to quench it in water. You can also quench your third hand as well. This will protect you and the next person using the soldering station in case you forget that your third hand is also hot. So I would just quench it in water. And to check your solder seams, all you have to do is clean your piece in pickle first, brass brush it, rinse it under tap water, and then you are going to use a flashlight on your phone and see if any light is shining through the solder seam. So this solder seam is good. And next, it is a demo on how to make jump rings. and how to do a wire-to-wire solder connection. So this tool that I'm using right here, you can sign up from the tool room. You can also use a wooden rod or even your pencil to wrap your wire around. And right now I'm just cutting with my pliers to remove them from the rod, and I am wrapping my jump rings with some masking tape. This helps you hold your jump rings easier. And when you're cutting, you want to use a saw, not a plier, because saw will give you a really clean cut, which means you will have a really tight fitting when you are soldering. And you will assemble your saw blade like when you are piercing, so that will be the same, and then you will just start cutting. After you make the cut, you will remove the masking tape, and then you will have really nice jump rings, and the fitting will be really tight because you used a saw, not a plier. And next, you will close your jump rings with some pliers. To prevent any marks on your jump ring, you can wrap your pliers with some masking tape as well. So this is like a protection of, and this is very similar to the rivet demo. So whenever you need to protect your metal from hammer marks or plier marks, you will wrap your metal with some tape or wrap your tools with some tape. And right now I am just closing the jump ring, and when you're closing the jump ring, you want to make sure that you're pushing it front and back, not left and right. And I am going to assemble the entire chain and solder everything at once. And now my chain is ready to be soldered. I will show you two different ways of soldering. So one is just lying down on your solder blocks, and the second will be using a third hand when you're soldering them by lying them out. You can solder multiple at once, and you don't need to do a bunch of adjustment. And again, I will start by heating the metal first, and I am heating up the entire jump ring until I see the flux go clear. Next, I'm just picking up the solder bits with my solder pick. I am heating up the solder pick as I pick the solder up. I will then continue by heating up the connection part of the jump ring. That is where I want my solder to flow. When you apply the solder bit with your solder pit, you want to make sure that you are directing heat on the metal part, not on your solder pick. Because if you heat up your solder pick too much, the solder will flow on your solder pick, not on the metal. And next, I will show you how to solder jump rings with a third hand. So the process is very similar. The only difference is when you use a third hand, it is more clear for you to see, but at the same time, you will have to do a bunch of adjustment. And again, I am heating up the jump ring entirely. And when I see the flux go clear, I will pick up the solder with my solder pick and continue heating and directing heat onto the part where I want my solder to flow. And in the video, you can see that I'm pulling the torch tip back and forth. This is because I see the brass is turning red, and that is also an indication of the brass is ready to melt if you continue heating it. And therefore, I would pull back my torch tip and then reheat if necessary. You want your piece to reach the temperature of solder melting, but not metal melting. Soldering is all about controlling the temperature and controlling the flame. You want to pull away quickly as soon as you see a flow of solder. Like what I was mentioning previously in the video, the third hand also acts as a heat shrink, and it is clear in the video that the left side is less red when I was soldering. And lastly, I want to show you how to solder wire to wire. And I will be needing two third hands. So I will have my solder station set up like this, and I will repeat the same thing, apply flux to the joint and start heating up the metal entirely. And then I will apply the solder with tweezers or the solder pick and continue heating. Again, the hottest part of your flame is the tip of the little inside flame of your flame. And like what I was mentioning in our demo last class, when you're annealing, you are using the fluffy part of the flame, so that will be the outside flame. But when you're soldering, you're using the inside of the flame, so that's the little one. And now I'm just picking up the solder bit with my tweezers and doing the same thing as I would when I'm using my solder pick. So you can use either or, depending on what you prefer. And again, when I am applying solder to the scene, I am directing heat onto the metal, not onto the tweezers. If you direct heat onto the tweezers, the solder will melt on your tweezers, because solder will only flow to places where it's hot the most. And after you're done soldering, it is important not to touch the tip with your hands. It is going to be hot, so you can quench them in water as well. And when you're removing, you can remove your piece with your tweezers, not with your hands. And now the soldering demo is over. I hope this video was helpful.